Blessed are you, holy and living one.
You come to your people and set them free.
The first reading is from the book of Jeremiah. Am I a God nearby, says the Lord, and not a God far off? Who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them, says the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, says the Lord? I have heard that the prophets have said, who prophesies lies in my name, saying, I have dreamed, I have dreamed. How long? Will the hearts of the prophets ever turn back? To those who prophesy lies, to prophesy the deceit of their own heart? They plan to make my people forget my name by their dreams that they tell one another, just as their ancestors forgot my name for Baal. Let the prophet who has a dream tell the dream, but let the one who has my word speak my word faithfully. What has straw in common with wheat, says the Lord? Is not my word like fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer that breaks a rock in pieces? Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people.
Thanks be to God.
We will say the psalm in half verses. God takes a stand in the council of heaven
and gives judgment in the midst of the gods.
How long will you judge unjustly?
And show favor to the wicked.
Save the weak and the orphan.
Defend the humble and needy.
Rescue the weak and the poor.
Deliver them from the power of the wicked.
They do not know, neither do they understand. They go about in darkness.
All the foundations of the earth are shaken.
Now I say to you, you are gods.
And all of you children of the Most High.
Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals.
And fall like any prince.
Arise, O God, and rule the earth.
For you shall take all nations for your own.
Our second reading is from the book of Hebrews. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were a dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell away after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their death by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all of these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer, the perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of joy was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people.
Thanks be to God. We have a choral piece that I'd invite you to remain seated for. And then when the chorus is finished, a good way to start a sermon with full disclosure, especially a sermon like this. Someone said to me that we preach best what we most need to hear. I need to be lit. I need my fire back. Reading the gospel and hearing Jesus talk about this stress that he's about to walk into, it just made me feel like I had a friend. Now, of course, I'm not equating the crucifixion and resurrection with me moving less than 10 miles. But I'm in the process of upheaval myself, and thanks to many of you, that's been made easier. But what happened is I was reading this, I was feeling the vulnerability that Christ was willing to live, to walk toward something, to admit that it's a big deal, that it's hard. It just made me feel like I have a friend in my little things, because of the way Jesus is a friend in the biggest, most loving way. So I arrive here preaching to myself, a word for you, a word for all of us, I hope. So, oh, that there would be fire on the earth, the gospel. How I wish that it was already kindled. Can you feel that with me? There's this longing. It's work to start fires over and over again. I remember one time we were getting ready for Song Circle, and George started the fire a couple hours before Song Circle, and he said, Allie, just make sure you keep it kindled, because we have 2 hours. And of course, I went in, I got busy, I think we had still point and did different things, and all of a sudden I looked out and there was no smoke coming up, and I kind of went, oh, I hope it's not out. And I went and it really looked out. And then I lifted over the logs a little bit, and there was this one coal, this one little spot that was red on the wood. And so I went and I gathered twigs, and I brought them all close to that one kindled spot, and the whole thing caught fire again. And so I feel like Jesus was wanting us to just hold the fire. Just hold it. Because if we keep it kindled, then he can keep bringing fire to us. But we all know what it's like to have to start from scratch over and over and over again. And I think Jesus felt that with a lot of his closest friends, like he had to start over and over. And somehow, as he's getting to the hardest part of his journey, he's just wanting us to keep our fire lit. So maybe he can just come along and just breathe lightly, and we'll flame up, we'll flare forth again. So I feel with Jesus this question that he's asking. I came to bring fire on the earth. Oh, how I wish it were already kindled. And I wanted to wonder with you about what fire is. I don't have the answers. I just have images that I hope will help us. I'm sure you've heard Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Someday, after mastering the winds and the waves and the tides and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And then, for a second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. Someday, after mastering the waves and the winds and the tides and the gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, And then for a second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. It's burning in the heart of Christ. Can we let it burn in our own hearts? Can we keep it kindled? I want to ask a question that I don't expect you to answer right now, but I hope that you're carrying around with you, or that you will carry around, and it's certainly one that I carry every day. And the question is, what is your image of God? Just in your most honest prayer time, private time, when you're up in the middle of the night like I was last night in a new bed in a new place, just what is it that you imagine God to be? There's no right or wrong answers right now. What do you imagine God to be? And then, does what you imagine God to be light you in love? Does it bring you alive? Does it lead you to catch fire? Does it make you fall in love again and again and again with God? Does it come close enough to touch you? Is it within you? That's the question that I steer by. Does this image I have of God have the capacity to move me, to bring me to life? And if it doesn't, and some days it doesn't for me, and then I have to go back and say, okay, show yourself to me freshly. We work with that all the time. If our image of God only speaks to our head, in other words, if it's thoughts, perfect thoughts, wonderful thoughts, but if it only goes here, I would say stay a little longer. Reach for something a little deeper. Because the mind is wonderful, but it's not our wholeness. It's only a part of it. So does the image of God have the capacity, maybe to start here, but then does it drop down into the heart, into the belly, into your feet walking, into your arms hugging? Does it consume you like fire? That's the invitation. That might be my number one invitation in the church, is how do we help each other with that? How do we help each other encounter the God that matters, that brings us alive? I want to throw in some science here, and we can play with what fire might be, because sometimes the images of science can really help me get it. Give me a metaphor, maybe. Fire is the result of applying enough heat to a fuel source when you have a whole lot of oxygen around. Okay? So you heard three things, kind of a trinity of fire. It's the result of applying enough heat to a fuel source with enough, well, not just enough, a lot of oxygen around. And listen to what happens. As the atoms in the fuel heat up, they begin to interact with one another. Wow, that's kind of cool. They vibrate. The atoms start to vibrate. And they rearrange themselves irreversibly. Now, this is not a preacher writing this. This is a scientist. But it's beautiful. The atoms in the fuel heat up, they begin to interact with one another, they vibrate, and they rearrange themselves irreversibly. In other words, never going back. Are we living that kind of faith? Never turning back. And they keep doing this. I like this part too. This is also science, and it's not poetry, it's not theologian. This is science, but it's so beautiful, to me at least. They do this until they break free of the bonds holding them. Is that not wonderful? I think that's wonderful. Fire is about breaking free of the bonds that are holding them intact. Well, that's kind of the scary part. I kind of like the things that are holding me in place. I liked my house where I was. I liked my mail going to one place. I liked my internet being set and my trash coming up from one address, and now all of that. Now, that's kind of funny. It's kind of silly for me to be thrown off kilter by that. But we like things to be in place. But to fall in love with God, to catch fire the way Jesus meant, we have to be willing to be rearranged, to vibrate a little bit. When I'm under stress, I just get really tight. I'm sure you've seen me. I just get really tight, and I nod a little bit. But fire will loosen, soften, allow for something to be rearranged. And it also says that until they break free the bonds holding them together, and those things, those bonds that are holding them together are released as volatile gases. So releasing the volatile gases. And we could play with that one too. Because I think the things that keep me stiff are not good for me, or you, or us. Charcoal, a new image for the church. May we be charcoal. Charcoal is wood that has been heated to remove all of the volatility from it and leaving behind carbon, which gives the capacity for light. That's why charcoal, when it burns, doesn't have smoke. So we need a song, may we be the charcoal for Jesus, something like that. So I'm going to write it. It'll be next one. Christina can help me with the music of it. So may we be willing to combust, willing to rearrange ourselves, willing to catch fire, willing to light up in a way that we weren't familiar with before. Some ideas about these three things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. For me, fuel, because Jesus is asking that we would be kindled, that we would be fuel. So his work is just to gently blow the Spirit, and we flare up again. So the fuel needed for this, I would say that that's our availability and our vulnerability. Again, things I have trouble with. So the fuel for the fire is simply us showing up as we are. Available, flaws, mistakes, forgiveness needed, forgiveness given, showing up, that risk of being seen, that's the fuel. Then you need heat. Heat, to me, is prayer. That's the beauty. Prayer is so important, and I see it as the heat needed to help the fuel come to life. Sometimes prayer can be deep silence. It can be just letting everything quiet down enough so that we can hear. There's a poem by Thomas Merton about prayerful silence, about the kind of prayer where we not only hear our own hearts, but we hear the silence that's in everything, the kind of silence that speaks of God. Thomas Merton. Finding the fire in silence. The whole world is secretly on fire. The stones burn, even the stones. They burn me. How can a man be still or listen to all things burning? That's the question of prayer. How do we be still and listen in that way? How can one dare to sit with them when all their silence is on fire? The whole world is secretly on fire. The stones burn, even the stones. They burn me. How can one be still or listen to all things burning? How can one dare to sit with them when all their silence is on fire? So I need prayer because if I'm willing to be vulnerable, which many times I'm not, but I work with it and eventually I get there. Usually at the end of the day when I think of all the weird things I did because I wasn't willing to be vulnerable. And then sometimes I'll just have George come close to help me soften. Sometimes I'm just sitting in prayer myself and try to return. So if we're going to take that risk of moving towards our vulnerability, we really need prayer. I really need prayer. I really need that depth, that stillness, because it's work that we do together. We do it together with God. We do it together with each other. Lost my page here. So we have fuel, which is our vulnerability, our availability. We have heat, which is the power of prayer, stillness, silence. And then we have oxygen. And I'll close with this image here. Oxygen, to me, is the interaction. I remember a mentor saying to me one time, Allie, you need to give it oxygen. When you're going through hard times, give it oxygen. And what she meant was say something to someone. In our world today, so many of us are really struggling. So many of us feel vulnerable. And if we keep it inside, it just turns to stone. But if we have the courage to find somebody that we trust and we just speak one piece, that's giving it oxygen. That's letting it leave the confines of my throat or my belly, and it goes into the air. It goes into relationship. This is catching fire. We'll end with Jesus' words. I came to bring fire to the earth. How I wish it were already kindled. Thanks be to God. So we're going to be singing this as our closing. I would just like to read the words before we leave singing it because they're pretty powerful. The God of heaven is present on earth in word, in silence and sharing, in the face of doubt, in depth of faith, in signs of love and caring, gentler than air, wilder than wind, settling, yet also deranging. The Spirit thrives in human lives, both changeless and yet changing. Far from the church, outside the fold, where prayer turns feeble and nervous, the Spirit wills society's ills be healed through humble service. From rural quiet to urban riot, in every social confusion, the Spirit pleads for all that leads to freedom from illusion. Truth after tears, trust after fears, God leaving everyone wiser. The Spirit springs through hopeless things, transforming what defies her.